Tell me about a time you had to take responsibility for a production issue introduction. This is a common behavioral interview question for software developers, backend developers, full-stack developers, senior developers, and team leads. Interviewers ask this question to understand: check whether you stay calm during production issues, whether you take ownership instead of blaming others, how you investigate production problems, how you communicate with stakeholders, how you coordinate with QA, support, DevOps, and business teams, how you restore service safely, how you prevent the same issue from happening again. This question is especially important for Java developers, backend developers, Spring Boot developers, full-stack developers, senior software developers, team leads, production support teams, Agile teams. The best way to answer this question is by using the STAR method. STAR means S, situation, explain the background; T, task, explain your responsibility; A, action, explain what you personally did; R, result, explain the final outcome. A good interview answer usually spends 10% situation, 10% task, 60% action, 20% result. The most important part is the action section, because interviewers want to understand how you took responsibility, investigated the issue, communicated clearly, fixed the root cause, and prevented recurrence. Question: tell me about a time you had to take responsibility for a production issue. Example 1. Taking responsibility for a production API failure situation. In one project, our team released a Spring Boot API change for updating customer profile information. After deployment, support reported that some users were receiving errors when updating their profile. The issue did not affect every user, but it affected users whose request did not include one optional field. Task: I had worked on part of the API change, so I took responsibility for investigating the issue, coordinating the fix, and communicating the status to the team. Action: I first acknowledged the issue and joined the production support discussion. I gathered details such as affected endpoint, error message, request payload pattern, number of affected users, deployment version, logs and correlation IDs, recent code changes. I reproduced the issue in a lower environment using a similar request payload. I found that the service logic assumed an optional field would always be present. When the field was missing, the API failed instead of handling the request safely. I communicated the root cause clearly without blaming anyone. I explained the API worked for the main flow, but it did not safely handle one optional field scenario. I missed that edge case during implementation, so I am fixing the null safe handling and adding regression tests. Then I implemented the fix. The fix included: check, null safe handling, validation update, regression test for missing optional field, test for optional field present, test for invalid request, test for valid request, log review to confirm no sensitive data exposure. I coordinated with QA to validate the fix. I also supported deployment and monitored production logs after release. Result: the issue was fixed quickly. Affected users could update their profile successfully. The regression tests help prevent the same issue from returning. I also updated my API development checklist to include optional field and edge case testing earlier. Why this answer works. This answer is strong because it shows key production ownership, key accountability, key root cause analysis, QA coordination, regression testing, prevention mindset. Example 2. Taking responsibility for incorrect report total situation. In one production application, business users reported that a daily report showed incorrect totals for certain date ranges. The issue affected records created near midnight. The report was important because business teams used it for daily operational decisions. Task: I took responsibility for investigating the calculation issue, fixing the root cause, and confirming the results with the business team. Action: I first reviewed the production report output and compared it with database records. I checked. Check. Affected date range. Check. Expected totals. Check. Actual totals. Report query. Check. Backend calculation logic. Time zone conversion. Check. Records near midnight. Recent changes. I found that the report logic was using UTC date boundaries, but the business expected the report to follow the local business time zone. That caused some records near midnight to appear under the wrong business date. I explained the issue to the product owner and business team in simple language. I said, the system was technically grouping records by one date boundary, but the business definition of a day is based on the local business time zone. That difference caused some records to appear on the wrong day. Then I fixed the back-end calculation logic. I added regression tests for check. Records near midnight. Check. Month-end records. Inclusive end date. Check. Daylight saving time scenarios. Check. Empty result. Check. Normal daytime records. I also worked with QA and the business team to validate sample reports before production deployment. Result. The report totals became accurate. The business team confirmed the corrected output. The team also updated reporting requirements to explicitly include time zone and date boundary rules. Why this answer works? This answer is good because it shows CAP, production data issue ownership, CAP, business impact awareness, CAP, time zone understanding, CAP, stakeholder communication, CAP, regression testing, CAP, requirement improvement. Example 3. Taking responsibility for Kafka consumer failure situation. In one microservices project, our service consumed customer update events from Kafka. After a deployment, the consumer started failing for certain messages, and Kafka lag increased. The issue created a risk that downstream systems would not receive updates on time. Task. I took responsibility for investigating the consumer failure and restoring normal message processing. Action. I first checked monitoring dashboards and logs. I reviewed Kafka consumer lag, Kafka failed message count, Kafka error logs, recent deployment changes, Kafka topic data, Kafka event payload examples, Kafka retry behavior. I found that a new field in the event payload was missing for some older event producers. Our consumer expected the field to always be present. Because of that, some messages failed repeatedly. I communicated the issue to the team and downstream stakeholders. I explained what was failing, why Kafka lag was increasing, which messages were affected, what fix was needed, how we would prevent message loss, how QA would validate the fix. Then, I updated the consumer to handle the missing field safely. I also improved the validation logic so invalid messages were handled correctly, instead of repeatedly blocking processing. The fix included SAC, backward compatible payload handling, better validation, improved error logging, DLQ handling for permanently invalid messages, regression tests for old and new payloads, monitoring after deployment. Result. Kafka lag returned to normal. Valid messages were processed successfully. Invalid messages were handled safely through the correct failure path. The team also improved event contract documentation with the producer team. Why this answer works? This answer is strong because it shows excellent Kafka production ownership, consumer lag investigation, backward compatibility, cross-team communication, DLQ and retry awareness, operational readiness. Example 4. Taking responsibility for a deployment configuration issue situation. In one release, a feature was deployed to production that depended on a new environment variable for an external service URL. The code was correct, but the production environment did not have the required configuration. As a result, the feature failed when users tried to access that flow. Task. I had worked on the feature, so I took responsibility for helping identify and resolve the deployment issue. Action. I first checked the logs and confirmed that the application was failing when trying to read the missing configuration. I compared lower environment configuration with production configuration. I found that the required environment variable had been added in QA, but was missing in production. I communicated the issue clearly to DevOps, QA, the product owner, and support. I explained. Code had deployed successfully. Code. The failure was due to missing production configuration. Which configuration was missing? What needed to be updated? What smoke tests should be rerun? What users were affected? I worked with DevOps to add the missing environment variable. After the configuration was updated, I helped run smoke tests and checked logs to confirm the feature was working. I also updated the release checklist to include: check new environment variables, check external URLs, secrets or configuration keys, check feature flags, smoke test steps, rollback notes, owner confirmation. Result: the production issue was resolved quickly. The feature started working correctly after the configuration update. The improved release checklist helped prevent similar configuration issues in future deployments. Why this answer works? This answer is good because it shows: check deployment ownership, check environment troubleshooting, check DevOps collaboration, check clear production communication, check checklist improvement, check practical prevention. Example 5. Taking responsibility for a performance issue after release situation. After releasing a new search feature, monitoring showed that API response time increased during peak usage. The feature worked functionally, but broad searches caused slow database queries. Task: I took responsibility for investigating the performance issue and improving the API response time. Action: I first reviewed monitoring data and logs. I checked average response time, slowest endpoints, request parameters, database query execution time, data volume, indexes, peak traffic pattern, timeout errors. I found that broad searches were scanning too many records because one common filter did not have the right index. The API also allowed large page sizes. I communicated the issue to the product owner and team. I explained that the feature was working correctly from a functional perspective, but performance needed improvement for production volume. Then I implemented improvements. The changes included: check database index for common search field, maximum page size, query optimization, better pagination rules, performance tests with larger data, monitoring after deployment. I also worked with QA to confirm the functional behavior did not change. Result: API response time improved significantly. Timeout risk was reduced. The product owner understood the trade-off between flexible search and production performance. The team also started reviewing performance risks earlier for large search features. Why this answer works? This answer is strong because it shows: performance ownership, monitoring usage, database optimization, stakeholder communication, QA validation, production readiness improvement. Example 6. Taking responsibility for failed batch job situation. In one production system, a nightly batch job failed and did not process a set of records. The job was important because downstream reports and operations depended on the processed data. Task: I took responsibility for investigating the failed batch job, recovering the missed records, and preventing a repeat failure. Action: I first checked the batch job logs and job execution history. I reviewed: failed step, input file or record count, error message, database state, retry history, recent code or configuration changes, downstream impact. I found that the job failed because one record had an unexpected value that was not handled by the validation logic. The failure stopped the job before the remaining valid records could be processed. I communicated the issue to the product owner, QA, and support team. I explained why the job failed, which records were affected, whether data was partially processed, how we would safely recover, what validation change was needed. Then I created a recovery plan. The plan included: identify unprocessed records, fix validation handling, rerun the job for the affected batch, validate processed counts, confirm downstream report results, add regression tests. I also updated the batch job so invalid records could be captured in an error report instead of stopping all valid records. Result: the missed records were processed successfully. Downstream reports were corrected. The batch job became more resilient because one bad record no longer stopped the entire batch. Why this answer works? This answer is good because it shows batch job ownership, recovery planning, data validation, stakeholder communication, resilience improvement, production support maturity. Example 7. Taking responsibility for an authorization issue situation. In one production release, a user role was not able to access a feature they were supposed to use. The feature had role-based access control, and one valid role had been missed during configuration. Task. I took responsibility for investigating the issue, correcting the role configuration, and confirming access behavior. Action. I first reviewed the user's role, the API logs, and the authorization configuration. I checked user role, endpoint access rules, Spring security configuration, service layer permission checks, front-end visibility rules, recent changes, expected business access. I found that the backend access rule allowed admin users but missed a business support role that should also have access. I communicated the issue clearly. I explained, which role was affected, which endpoint was blocked, why access was denied, what configuration needed to change, what tests would be added. I updated the authorization rules and added tests for check, admin access, business support access, normal user blocked, missing token, invalid token, unauthorized role. I also reviewed related endpoints to confirm the same role was not missed elsewhere. Result. The affected users regained access. QA verified role-based scenarios successfully. The team added a role permission matrix to future stories to avoid missing valid roles. Why this answer works? This answer is strong because it shows check, security ownership, check, access control troubleshooting, check, Spring security awareness, check, role-based testing, check, business impact awareness. Example 8. Taking responsibility for a release regression situation. In one release, we refactored shared validation logic used by multiple APIs. The refactor passed tests for the new feature, but after deployment, one older API behaved differently for a specific validation case. Support reported the regression shortly after release. Task. I had worked on the shared validation change, so I took responsibility for investigating the regression and restoring the expected behavior. Action. I first reviewed the support report and reproduced the issue in a lower environment. Then I traced all APIs that used the shared validator. I found that the older API had a slightly different validation expectation that was not covered by the original test suite. I communicated the issue to the team and product owner. I explained. Check, the refactor changed shared behavior. One older API had a special validation case. The missing test allowed the regression. The fix would restore backward compatibility. Additional regression tests would be added. Then I fixed the validator to support both the new feature and the older API behavior. I added tests for new feature validation, older API validation, edge cases, invalid input, valid input, backward compatibility. I also worked with QA to identify other flows that could be affected by the shared validator. Result. The regression was fixed quickly. The affected API returned to expected behavior. The shared validator ended up with stronger test coverage, and the team improved impact analysis for shared code changes. Why this answer works? This answer is good because it shows ownership of regression, shared code awareness, impact analysis, backward compatibility, QA collaboration, prevention process. Best short answer version. If you need a short interview answer, you can say, in one project, I worked on a Spring Boot ATI for updating customer profile information. After deployment, support reported that some users were getting errors when updating their profile. I took responsibility because I had worked on part of the API change. I reviewed logs, correlation IDs, request payloads, and recent code changes. I found that the service logic assumed an optional field would always be present. When that field was missing, the API failed instead of handling the request safely. I communicated the root cause clearly to the team and explained that I had missed that edge case during implementation. I fixed the null safe handling, added regression tests for optional field present and missing scenarios, coordinated with QA for validation, and supported the deployment. As a result, The issue was fixed quickly, affected users could update their profiles, and the new regression tests helped prevent the same issue from returning. I also updated my API development checklist to include optional field and edge case testing earlier. Common mistakes to avoid. 1. Blaming another team. Bad answer. It was caused by QA because they did not test that case. Better answer. I took ownership of the issue, reproduced it, fixed the root cause, and added regression coverage. 2. Sounding careless. Bad answer. I accidentally broke production. Better answer. A specific edge case was missed during development, and I corrected it quickly with tests and process improvements. 3. Hiding the impact. Bad answer. It was just a small issue. Better answer. Some users were affected, so I treated it seriously and communicated the impact clearly. 4. Fixing without communication. Bad answer. I fixed it and moved on. Better answer. I communicated the status, root cause, fix plan, validation steps, and prevention actions. 5. No prevention. Bad answer. The issue was resolved. Better answer. I added regression tests, updated documentation, and improved the checklist to prevent recurrence. Best practices for answering this question. Use the STAR method. Choose a real but manageable production issue. Take responsibility clearly. Avoid blaming others. Explain the user or business impact. Describe how you investigated. Explain how you communicated. Explain how to fix. Include QA or stakeholder validation. Explain what you changed afterward. What interviewers are looking for. Interviewers want to see whether you can take ownership under pressure, stay calm during production issues, investigate systematically, communicate clearly, protect users and business operations, coordinate with others, fix the root cause, prevent repeated incidents, learn from production problems. For senior roles, they also want to see VASH, incident leadership, stakeholder communication, root cause analysis, release judgment, production support maturity, monitoring and observability awareness, prevention mindset, accountability without blame. Strong words to use in your answer. You can use words like took responsibility, investigated, reproduced, triaged, communicated, coordinated, identified root cause, mitigated, restored service, validated, monitored, added regression tests, documented, prevented recurrence. Example: I took responsibility for the production issue by joining the triage immediately, identifying the root cause, communicating the impact and fix plan, coordinating QA validation, supporting the deployment, monitoring production afterward, and adding regression tests to prevent recurrence. Good production issue topics you can use. Depending on your experience, you can talk about production API failure, incorrect report totals, Kafka consumer failure, deployment configuration issue, API performance issue, failed batch job, authorization issue, release regression, missing environment variable, database query timeout, failed integration with downstream service, duplicate event, processing, invalid data in production, monitoring alert investigation, rollback or hotfix support. Final summary. Tell me about a time you had to take responsibility for a production issue is an important interview question because production problems test ownership, communication, judgment, and technical skill. The best answer should include what production issue happened, who or what was affected, why you took responsibility, how you investigated, how you communicated, what fix or mitigation you applied, how QA or stakeholders validated the fix, how you monitored afterward, what you changed to prevent recurrence. Good examples include API failure from missed edge case, incorrect report totals, Kafka consumer failure, deployment configuration issue, performance issue, failed batch job, authorization issue, release regression.
The strongest answers show accountability, calm investigation,
Clear communication, user impact awareness, technical problem solving, and long-term prevention.